Joining me now is William Ruger, president of the American Institute for Economic Research. William, why does it seem like there is such a wide array of political forces opposed to, or at least not helpful in, the pursuit of ending this war as soon as possible?
Well, thank you for having me, Laura. I think one of the big problems here is that there are parts of the foreign policy elite that are ideologically driven towards this position. They're not prudential. They're not realists, like I just heard you talk about, right? They don't understand the world as it is, as opposed to this kind of idealistic world they would like it to be. And that leads them to want to, in some ways, have an unintended consequence of actually harming the people that they would like to help. And I think it's largely because of this ideological project. And we've seen this over the last 20 to 30 years, actually. It's of a piece, even though this is a different front. It's similar to what we saw in Afghanistan, the people that opposed the withdrawal and still think it was a bad idea for America to end its longest war. So I think that's one of the big problems, is that we're talking about realism, which you expressed, which I expressed, which so many more Americans believe in, and that kind of ideological nature of the foreign policy establishment in Washington.
Yeah, that poll that came out, I think it's a YouGov poll that came out a couple of days ago, when people just ask, do you think we should help with a no-fly zone? There's a lot of support among the American people when you say a no-fly zone where American military aircraft could engage with Russian aircraft and expand this military conflict. The numbers completely flip, and overwhelmingly against involvement in a no-fly zone with that context. I mean, they had to admit that in the poll. That really tells the story, does it not? And the people were saying the same thing from about 2006 or so on regarding Iraq and then ultimately in Afghanistan. They wanted our troops home.
Yeah, I think when Americans appreciate the cost that could occur, and we saw that again in Afghanistan, where they understood that if we continued to stay there, it was going to be more Americans suffering, more Americans coming home at Dover, and more dollars out the door. But I think when Americans appreciate the cost, they know that this is not a good deal for Americans because, again, this is just not in our national interest. We don't want to get into a war with Russia, a nuclear-armed Russia, over Ukraine, which, again, we can feel terrible for the people of Ukraine and the tragedy of this aggression by Putin. But it isn't our fight, and we need to avoid an escalation into that. And, what's funny is that even academics realize this no-fly zone is a bad idea, right? I did a study that just came out today that showed that only 7% of international relations scholars believe that a no-fly zone is a good idea. I mean, again, there's just a kind of anti-realism involved in these people who say, yeah, let's risk it all. I mean, that's just got us down this terrible road all along, right? Back to 2003 in Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Libya, an underrated bad war. So again, we shouldn't listen to these same olds. We need a new guard. And fortunately, I think there are more people, not just the base of Americans, but others in Washington that are kind of bubbling up and exercising this voice.
Well, the State Department, more often than not, is really dismissive of the idea that Vladimir Putin, as horrible and evil as he is, would ever pursue any real negotiations that end up in ending this madness. Watch.
Our concern has been the strong possibility that what the Russians are engaging in is something akin to the pretense of diplomacy. In other words, going through the motions. We need to see happen less words and more action on the ground.
William, the State Department just doesn't seem to be interested in getting involved here, and certainly not ushering us toward a peaceful resolution after the slaughter that's taken place.
Yeah, I mean, we don't want a situation where, for these ideological reasons, we're willing to see the Ukrainians fight to the very last person. There's an unintended consequence here of people dying and suffering on the grounds when this is going to end up in a negotiated settlement. And that's a settlement that, unfortunately, we should have had before this crisis turned into a war. I mean, this issue of the enlargement of NATO, of the military-to-military exercises that the West has had with places like Ukraine and Georgia to increase military interoperability. These are things that Russia has signaled were real problems. And again, that doesn't justify the aggression, but it does show you that we've been pushing, and there's been a pushback. And I think that we really need to think about ways to peace, ways to stability, especially because our interest is mainly in avoiding an escalatory spiral into a war, particularly a nuclear conflict. And we need to find ways to cooperate on those issues with Russia, because that's what diplomacy does, right? It works with not just friends, but adversaries to find a path towards our national interests.
Well, backing people into a corner is always a very risky move. William, thank you. Good to see you tonight.